Okay, so we've got this document mandate for leadership, and wow, it's a lot.
It's ambitious, that's for sure.
It's like a blueprint for like a complete conservative takeover of, well, everything, the courts, Congress, you name it.
They're not shy about their goals, that's for sure. They lay out a very specific vision for what they want the government to look like.
And it's not just like policy tweaks here and there either. It's like a full-on call to action, you know?
Right, there's a real sense of urgency in this document. They're saying the stakes are way higher now than even, like, during the Reagan Revolution.
Yeah, they keep saying that. Like, why? What's so different now?
Well, they argue that America is facing, like, unprecedented threats, both internally and from external forces. They see this as a really critical moment in history.
Okay, but what does that even mean? Threats from who?
Well, they point to things like what they call the rise of cultural Marxism
Yeah.
and the erosion of traditional values. They also see China's growing influence as a major threat to American dominance on the world stage.
Cultural Marxism, huh? That feels a little loaded, doesn't it?
It's definitely a term with a lot of baggage, but it reflects a worldview that sees, like a lot of modern social movements, as the threat to traditional power structures.
Right, right. Okay, so they're worried about threats to American values and like global standing. But then they also go on this whole thing about the administrative state. What's that all about?
So the administrative state is basically the term they use to describe the vast network of government agencies that have a lot of power to make and enforce regulations. Think like the EPA, the FDA, all those agencies you don't always think about, but that have a huge impact on your life.
Okay, so bureaucracy, basically. What's wrong with that?
Well, they argue that these agencies have become too powerful. They say that Congress passes intentionally vague laws, which then gives unelected bureaucrats the power to interpret and enforce them in ways that go beyond what Congress intended.
So it's like Congress is passing the buck and these agencies are just running wild.
That's their argument.
Yeah.
They see it as deeply undemocratic and a threat to individual liberty.
But isn't the executive branch, the president and their cabinet supposed to be in charge of all those agencies?
That's exactly their point. They argue that a strong executive branch is essential to rein in what they see as administrative state overreach. They're basically saying the president needs to step in and assert more control over how these agencies operate.
So if you're worried about unelected officials having too much power, is giving even more power to the president the answer? It seems like there's room for debate there. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a complex issue, for sure. There are valid arguments on all sides. But this document definitely comes down firmly on the side of a powerful executive branch as the way to enact their vision.
Interesting. So they're talking about threats to America, the dangers of bureaucracy, and the need for a strong leader. It sounds like they're trying to paint a picture of a country that's like on the brink and in need of a drastic course correction.
Exactly. They're establishing a sense of urgency, a need for decisive action. And nowhere is that sense of urgency more palpable than when they get to the topic of national defense. They argue that the Department of Defense, the single biggest chunk of our federal government, is being systematically weakened from the inside out.
Systematically weakened. That's a strong claim. How do they back that up?
Well, they point to several factors. First, they're deeply concerned about declining military readiness. Basically, they're questioning whether our armed forces are actually equipped and prepared for a major conflict.
And they think the answer is no.
They have serious doubts. They also highlight concerns about our defense industrial base, the companies that actually build our weapons and equipment. They say it's shrinking, making us too reliant on other countries, which could be a major vulnerability in a crisis.
Okay, so they're worried about our ability to, like, actually fight a war if we had to.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the elephant in the room, China. They practically dedicate an entire chapter to sounding the alarm about China's rise, both militarily and economically.
Yeah, they're definitely not mincing words when it comes to China. They even dropped this, like, really stark statistic. They say the Air Force is planning to retire something like 1,400 aircraft, while only buying 467 new ones over the next 5 years.
It's a pretty dramatic reduction.
Hmm.
And they're using it to argue that the current administration is failing to take the threat from China seriously enough.
So they're painting a picture of a world where America is falling behind and China is gaining ground. It's a pretty bleak outlook.
They definitely want to shake things up. They see China's growing military might as a direct challenge to U.S. dominance on the world stage. But it goes beyond just military power.
What else are they worried about?
They're concerned about China's economic influence, their technological advancements, even their cultural reach. They argue that China is engaged in a long-term strategy to displace the U.S. as the world's leading superpower, and they believe we need to be much more assertive in countering that.
So it's a multi-pronged challenge.
Exactly. They want to see the U.S. pushing back against China's growing influence on all fronts, militarily, economically, diplomatically. They even argue that we need to rethink our entire approach to foreign aid.
You mean like USA, the agency that provides aid to other countries? What's their take on that?
They're pretty critical, actually. They argue that USA has become bloated and bureaucratic, more focused on promoting what they see as a woke agenda than on actually advancing American interest.
Woke agenda meaning?
Well, they specifically criticize things like diversity and inclusion initiatives within USA. They argue that these programs are a distraction from the agency's core mission, which they believe should be about promoting American values and strategic interests abroad.
So less global outreach and a more focused approach to foreign aid.
Precisely. They want to see USA leaner, more efficient, and laser-focused on what they see as core American priorities. They argue that we need to be much more strategic in how we use foreign aid to advance our national interests.
Wow, we're just getting started, and it's already clear this document doesn't pull any punches. They've got a lot to say about practically every corner of the government, but one thing's for sure, they're laying out a very specific roadmap for what a conservative-led America would look like. And it all seems to hinge on this idea of returning to what they see as, quote-unquote, first principles.
Right, and that's what makes this so fascinating. It's not just a dry policy document. It's a statement of values, a call to action. Whether you agree with their vision or not, understanding their arguments is crucial in today's political climate.
Absolutely. Now let's dive into some of the specifics. You mentioned they take aim at the State Department. What's their beef there?
Well, they really don't hold back. You know, they basically accuse the State Department, the folks who are supposed to be handling diplomacy, of being way too focused on what they call globalism.
Globalism, huh? What does that even mean in this context?
Basically, they're saying the State Department cares more about international institutions and, like, global cooperation than looking out for America's interests first.
So less cozying up to the UN and more like America first on the world stage.
That's the gist of it. They want to see a real shift in priorities, you know, a return to what they call first principles,
Yeah.
basically putting American sovereignty front and center.
So a more go-it-alone approach to foreign policy. Got it. But it's not all foreign policy in this thing, is it? I mean, we're talking about everything from healthcare to education to agriculture.
It's true. This document really does cover a lot of ground. It's like they took every conservative talking point from the last few decades and crammed it into one giant manifesto.
Okay, so what about healthcare? What's their take on that?
Well, they're pretty scathing in their assessment of the Department of Health and Human Services. They basically accuse them of being too focused on pushing a, quote, woke agenda, especially when it comes to things like gender identity and sexual orientation.
Oh boy, here we go.
They specifically call out agencies like the CDC and the NIH, saying they've become too politicized and overstepped their bounds, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic.
So they're going after, like, Dr. Fauci territory here.
You could say that. They claim that these agencies, instead of just sticking to science, have been pushing what they call junk science, driven by ideology rather than, evidence.
So a pretty dim view of the public health establishment then.
You could say that. They even go so far as to call for a major shakeup in how medical research gets funded. Like, they want to see the NIH's role significantly scaled back.
Wow. It sounds like they want to completely overhaul the entire healthcare system.
They definitely want to see some major changes, that's for sure. And it's not just healthcare. Education is another big one for them.
Really? What's their take on education?
Well, unsurprisingly, they're big on school choice. They argue that the Department of Education has become way too big, too bureaucratic, too meddling in local affairs.
So less Washington, more local control. That's a familiar refrain.
Right. They want to see more power in the hands of parents, more options for families. They're big on things like school vouchers and education savings accounts.
So if you want to send your kid to a private school, they're all for it. What about those hot-button cultural issues like, what's being taught in schools, that kind of thing?
Oh, they definitely have thoughts on that. They're very critical of what they see as the increasing focus on things like critical race theory and gender identity in schools.
So they see that as a problem.
They see it as indoctrination, basically. They argue that schools should be focused on teaching kids the basics, reading, writing, arithmetic, not pushing what they see as a particular ideological agenda.
Okay, so less woke education, more traditional values.
That's one way to put it. And it's not just education either. They have similar concerns about the Department of Agriculture.
Agriculture, like farms and food, what's their issue there?
They argue that the USDA, instead of focusing on supporting American farmers and ranchers, has become way too caught up in environmental regulations and, climate change concerns.
So less emphasis on things like organic farming and sustainable agriculture.
They would say those things are all well and good, but they shouldn't come at the expense of American farmers' ability to, do their jobs and feed the country.
So a more traditional approach to agriculture then. Less regulation, more freedom for farmers to farm.
Exactly. And they apply that same kind of thinking to a whole range of other issues. Energy, for example, is another big one.
What's their take on energy?
Well, they're very critical of the Biden administration's focus on renewable energy and what they see as an obsession with climate change.
So more drilling, less solar panels.
Pretty much. They want to see a major shift back towards American energy independence. They argue that by, unleashing the power of the free market and getting government out of the way, we can increase domestic energy production, lower costs for consumers, and create jobs.
So drill, baby, drill.
They would say it's not that simple, but yeah, that's the general idea. And they apply that same logic to a whole host of other agencies and departments.
Like what?
Well, they want to see significant reforms to the Environmental Protection Agency, arguing that it's become too powerful, too bureaucratic, and too hostile to business.
So less regulation, more freedom for companies to operate?
Precisely. And they have similar criticisms of the Department of Labor.
What's wrong with the Department of Labor? I mean, aren't they supposed to protect workers?
They are, but this document argues that they've gone too far in that direction. They claim that the Department of Labor has become too beholden to unions and that their regulations are actually stifling job growth.
So they want to see a more business-friendly approach to labor relations.
You could say that. They want to tip the scales back towards employers a bit.
It sounds like a recurring theme here.
It is. Less government intervention, more reliance on the free market, and a strong belief in individual liberty and personal responsibility. Those are kind of the guiding principles that run through this entire document.
Right. We're seeing that government is the problem, not the solution. Philosophy playing out across the board here.
Exactly. And it even extends to things like transportation. They're very critical of the Department of Transportation, arguing that it's too focused on things like mass transit and not enough on roads and bridges.
So more highways, less subways.
That's the gist of it. They're big on individual choice and freedom of movement. They believe that people should be able to get where they need to go as efficiently as possible, and that often means driving.
And I'm guessing they're not big fans of government regulations on cars either.
You would guess correctly. They see those regulations as burdensome and unnecessary. They'd rather let the free market decide things like fuel efficiency standards.
Okay, so less government interference, more personal freedom. Got it. It's interesting, though, because they seem to have no problem with a strong, assertive government when it comes to things like national security and law enforcement.
That's true. They're very big on law and order. And when it comes to agencies like the Department of Justice, particularly the FBI, they don't hold back.
What's their issue with the FBI? What's their issue with the FBI?
They practically accuse them of being a political weapon, basically. They point to, those high-profile cases where they think the FBI was out to get conservatives, and they say it's part of a larger pattern of bias.
So less political witch hunts and more like just catching bad guys.
Basically. They want to see a major overhaul, like a top-to-bottom reform of the FBI. They say it needs to be totally rebuilt to, get its integrity back and make sure it's about upholding the law, not playing politics.
Sounds like a tall order.
Yeah, it would be a huge undertaking.
Yeah.
And they're not stopping there. They want the whole Justice Department to take a way tougher stance on immigration, too.
Which, I mean, tracks with what we've been hearing from some conservative lawmakers, right? Like, border security is a big deal for them.
Huge. They want stricter enforcement of immigration laws, a stronger border, a real crackdown on what they call illegal immigration. No more, being lenient in their view.
And remember how we were talking about them wanting a really strong executive branch earlier? They even suggest that. Like, the DOJ could be used to challenge immigration policies from the other branches of government if they think those policies are unconstitutional.
It's all part of this vision they have, right? This idea of a more assertive, less bureaucratic government that's really focused on what they see as those core American interests. It's not just about immigration or national security either. This philosophy extends to, like, everything, even the economy.
Wait, are you telling me they have ideas for fixing the economy too?
Oh, yeah. They lay out this very, like, classic conservative approach to economic policy. Lower taxes, less regulation, a real belief in the power of the free market. They think that's the best way to, like, create growth and prosperity.
Sounds like Reaganomics is making a comeback.
It's definitely got that vibe. They're really concerned about government spending, the national debt, all that. They even want to, like, totally reform the Federal Reserve.
The Fed! What's wrong with the Fed?
They argue that it's gotten way too powerful and that it's too easy for it to, like, manipulate the economy for political reasons.
So their solution is what? Less government involvement in the economy? More free market principles.
That's the main idea. They see this very strong link between economic freedom and individual liberty. And, that kind of thinking influences how they view trade, too. Like, they're really critical of what they call unfair trade deals, especially the ones with China.
So no more Mr. Nice Guy in the global marketplace.
Well, they're not against free trade exactly. It's more that they want it to be, like, fair trade, trade that benefits American workers and businesses first. They're not afraid to use tariffs or other tools to try to, like, level the playing field.
So it's more about being strategic in how we engage with the global economy, not just, like, shutting everyone out.
Right, exactly. And they take a similar approach to financial regulations. They think that, like, the Dodd-Frank Act, the one that came after the 2008 financial crisis, went way too far and ended up holding back economic growth.
So less Wall Street regulation. Isn't that, like, how we got into that mess in the first place?
Well, they would argue that too much regulation can actually make things worse, that it can stifle innovation and create all these unintended consequences. They'd rather see a more market-based approach that, encourages growth without sacrificing consumer protections.
It's a tough balance to strike, for sure. But, okay, we've talked about the economy, national security. What about all the changes happening in the digital world? What's their take on tech?
They get really specific about this. Like, they have a whole section on the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, the one that regulates, like, the internet and stuff.
This is getting into, like, net neutrality territory, right?
Yeah.
And big tech and free speech online, all that.
That's right. They think the FCC has gotten way too political and too heavy-handed. They don't like how much the government is involved in regulating the internet. And they're really concerned about anything that they see as an attempt to, like, limit free speech online.
Whether it's the government doing it or, like, those big tech companies, right?
Exactly. They believe very strongly in the power of free markets, and that includes the digital marketplace. And they believe just as strongly in free speech, no matter where it happens. They even suggest that, like, the FCC could be used to go after Section 230.
Wow, that's a big one. Section 230 is, like, the law that protects online platforms from being held liable for what their users post.
Right. It's a huge part of how the internet works.
Right.
And they want to see it changed.
It's really incredible how far-reaching their vision is. They want to shake things up across the board. Is there anything else on their hit list?
Well, they do take aim at the Federal Election Commission, too. They say it's become too partisan and that it's focused too much on, like, limiting political speech, especially conservative speech.
So how we run our elections, that's not off limits either.
Nope, not in their view. They want to see reforms that they say would protect free speech and create a more level playing field.
Wow, that's a lot. I mean, we've really covered a lot of ground today. This mandate for leadership document is, like, seriously comprehensive. They have a plan, or at least a very strong opinion, about pretty much every aspect of the government.
It's true. It's a really fascinating look at what a, like, fully realized conservative vision for America could look like. And, you don't have to agree with every single proposal to appreciate just how detailed and thought out it is.
Totally. It's a valuable document, even just for understanding the current political landscape.
100%. Whether you agree with their ideas or not, this document lays out the conservative agenda in a very clear and concise way. It's essential reading for anyone who wants to understand where the conservative movement is headed.
Absolutely. This deep dive has given us, and hopefully all of our listeners, a lot to consider.
It's definitely given me a lot to think about.
If there's one thing we can all agree on, it's that the role of government is always evolving. It's up to us as citizens to stay informed, to participate in these discussions, and ultimately decide what kind of future we want to build.
Couldn't agree more.
And who knows, maybe this mandate for leadership will be the blueprint that some future administration uses to do just that.
It's definitely possible. It'll be interesting to see how much influence it has in the years to come.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the mandate for leadership, the conservative promise.
My pleasure. It's always great to chat with you.
And to all of you listening out there, keep those brains engaged and those conversations flowing. We'll be back next time with another fascinating topic to explore. Until then, take care.